Hi, this is Siofra Bradigan, and this is Siofra's Magic Alcove. So, it's always interesting to find out when your brain has got a piece of information that you're absolutely certain about wrong, which is what happened to me last night. I've been wanting to tell this particular story at length, and I wanted to get my facts straight so I could remember where I got the information from. And I was pretty convinced that I got the information from a very specific book, which I tracked down and downloaded a copy of it and read. And it's not in that book. So I don't know where it comes from. Confession. Maybe you do, and if this makes you think of anything, then please let me know. I'd appreciate it. So I want to talk about some of my encounters with non-human spirits. These are beings that have been around for before humans ever came into the picture. They are wandering the planet. They're huge, most of them, the ones I've met so far at any rate. And you have to be careful when you encounter one. And if you have a clue of how to act, it helps. And this is the one where I thought I read about the clue, and that's what I did, and it worked. But I don't know where the clue was. So it's a mystery. So this happened in Monterey, California, when I was living in Santa Cruz, and before I moved up to Oregon. So let's see, probably this might have been 1988, 89, somewhere in there, because I moved up here in 90. I think, yeah, the fall of 1990 is when I moved to Oregon, or early 91, somewhere along that winter, in any rate. And the man that I was going out with at the time had a cabin out in the woods, a family cabin, and decided to take us out there for a weekend. This wasn't the big Sur retreat that I went on that I've talked about. This was a different one. And he had actually built his own stone circle. He was in the process of making a stone circle, making it a sacred place, and all that. And it was a really nice place in the woods, not anyone around at all. And towards evening, we went for a walk through the woods. So, we're just walking through the woods. Everything seems to be normal. And then all of a sudden, I don't know how to exactly explain it, but something changed. It was a intense feeling in the air, electric, that came over me, and I stopped. Like, it stopped me in my tracks. And I looked around, and the shadows in the woods suddenly became different than ordinary shadows. They were like dangerous shadows. It was like there were things that were in those shadows, and I had this very specific feeling in my body and my mind that said that if I ran, they would get me. And they were dangerous. It's like, these are not gentle, sweet little creatures. Whatever they are, this is like a bad thing. And then I felt something coming, a very large something. It's sort of a weird thing to have happen to you. And a lot of times people don't believe that you're telling the truth when you experience something like this, but this is my recollection, and accurate as possible as I can make it to what happened. And I knew what was coming. Now this is where it gets confusing to me, because what was coming, I knew what it was, and I knew what to do, and I knew how to get through it safely because I had read about it in a book, not the book I thought. And this thing was, probably about 15 feet high and about 40 feet long. I mean, it's the biggest being I've encountered so far. bigger than any of the god forms I've encountered. This thing was just humongous. And it had two heads, but they were at opposite ends. So it's like this very large being with a head here and a head here. And I knew that this was a native spirit, and I knew that if we ran, we would go crazy. It was like the only thing you can do encountering something of this nature, or at least the only thing I could do at the time, was to stand my ground and be as still as possible and then wait for it to come. And the story that I had read in whatever book it was went that you stand there and the first head approaches and stands in front of you, and you have to wait for the second head to make its way around, because that's what it's looking for. It's looking for a warrior spirit that can withstand the fear of encountering it and allow it to see its other half. It's like it's the only time that it gets to see the other head is when this happens, apparently. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what I thought. And so I stood and waited, and when the first head approached, I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine something with that much energy that's that huge in the middle of the woods that's just coming right in front of you. It was like 8 feet away, and there it was. It was this huge presence. And then I waited because there was nothing else I could do. And then the other head comes around, and when the other head made it and the heads looked at each other, everything changed. The whole woods changed. All of a sudden, the shadows weren't sharp and dangerous anymore. All of a sudden, nature spirits just came out of the woodwork from all over the place. And it was like this huge sigh of relief. Everything was just like, ha, cool, we're all okay. And when this was going on, the man I was with and myself, it was like we had this, what would you call it, overshadowing of the Lord and the Lady just kind of descend upon us. And it was like I became the lady, and then I led this troop of spirits back to the cabin, and all of the nature spirits came flooding into the cabin, and I was sitting there and I was telling them stories. I was telling them creation stories about how life came to be. It was like all these things just kind of flowed out of me, and the large two-headed dragon thingy was like circling the cabin on the outside, which I was grateful, because it would be bigger than the cabin, so being outside was a good thing. And this went on for hours, and then finally I ran out of steam, I'm guessing, and decided I probably needed to try and go to sleep. And so I laid down, and I really didn't get much sleep that night because I was very aware of that being circling the cabin. And my kundalini started rising, and my body was doing all sorts of stuff like it does when the kundalini energy starts to come up. And that happened all night long. So it was similar as far as intensity went to when I opened up the portal between the worlds. It was that kind of like moment in my life where something so amazing and wondrous and intense and unexpected happened. It kind of shattered any preconceived notions I might have had at that point. And what I knew from however I found this out, whether it was just information that came through me, which happens sometimes, or a book I don't remember reading anymore, but I knew that if you couldn't do what I did, then this creature would drive you mad. I mean, you would go literally insane. And so, I went back to town, and I was like, boing, And believe it or not, I was not doing any drugs at all during this time frame. There were no drugs happening. That was long in the past, and I wasn't into doing any drugs of any kind at that point. So it wasn't because I was on some kind of a substance that altered my perceptions of reality and got me a jump start into it. It just sort of happened. Since then, I met another one, and this happened up the coast of Oregon. I was up there visiting a group of people, and we went on what they called a ferry walk as the sun was setting. Apparently, when the sun is beginning to go down during twilight or first thing in the morning, when it's in that kind of transition phase, is the easiest time for people to encounter the fairy folk. And I had actually encountered them on the walk up to that point, where I smelled mint, which is something common for me. I smell mint, and I heard a word in my head asking me if that was a shillelagh, and did not know what a shillelagh was at the time. The person I was with told me that that was an Irish walking stick, and I realized that my staff was sort of, it has all those curves and stuff in it, the spiral in it, which is somewhat similar to the blackthorn that they use for the shillelagh in Ireland. So that was kind of interesting in and of itself. But we went farther down that path, and this was, like I said, just twilight, just starting. It was still easy to see. And we got to a crossroad, and then all of a sudden I felt it again. I felt it. And it's such a distinctive sensation. I knew immediately what it was. And there were three of us that were there. And so since I had been through it before, I told everybody what was coming and what was happening, and I told them what to do, and we all stood still, and I waited. And this wasn't as difficult for me as the first time, but the woman that we were with, she didn't sense anything, she said. And then later she had a psychotic break, which is sort of an interesting result from her encounter with this, and I think a direct result. So it's just sort of a word of caution that sometimes these things can cause us to lose our bearings in the world and shift things quickly and without warning. So I call it a dragon because of its size. It's not a typical dragon like you would expect from mythology and stuff like that. But I have seen a few other types. I was flying in a plane once, and I don't like flying in planes. I can feel gravity pulling us down the whole time we're up there, and I'm like, okay, I'm the one who keeps the plane flying if I'm on the plane. It's kind of like, yeah, like this is not natural. Yeah, it's not a happy place for me. But I was looking out the window, just sort of gazing out the window, and I saw this huge, definitely dragon-esque spirit, more of a Chinese dragon because it didn't have wings, floating on the air currents. And I thought, oh, I see. So they're like in charge of the currents up in the upper part of the atmosphere. And so they can influence the weather, for example, by changing where the currents are going up there and, moving them around. I didn't say anything to it because it was just sort of doing its thing and flying by. I just happened to be in a position to actually notice it. And I've seen them other times from the ground doing sky gazing. And I've seen every so often, I've seen one of those kinds of spirit beings fly by. And then there was another one I saw in a river, and it was different, and it was like a water being, but it was again like a dragon size creature, and its back and curves and curls and stuff like that along its length became part of the current and the rapids that were in that part of the river suddenly took on that aspect, and I could actually see it moving through the water. Now, I didn't encounter it directly again because it was like over there by the river. I was up in a room. We were at a hot springs in Central Oregon, and I was just doing some water gazing and looking to see what I could see and getting better at seeing nature spirits and stuff, and so I saw that. So that was another one. So there's a group of these spirits that I've encountered, and then I encountered a different type altogether when I was up in a town that's just north of us, checking out someone's property, and it was stuck in a house where it shouldn't be. And that one was definitely more wild animal kind of feeling to it. I heard a lot of growling, saw a lot of claws. It felt uncomfortable with me. I had to back away when I approached it, and it got uncomfortable with how close I was, and suddenly had this like, "Who the hell do you think you are?" kind of reaction, and I like gave it some space. And that's the thing, is like having lived in the wilderness, in the bush, with more animals than people. I mean, where I lived for about 5 years, there were more bears than there were people. And then on top of that, we had wolves and coyotes and moose and eagles and, all sorts of, and we had cougar and bobcat. So there were a lot of potentially dangerous animals, and you developed an instinct to how to behave when you encounter something like that, because the world is a dangerous place. And this is sort of along the lines of a lot of times when people begin a path in paganism and, worshiping the earth and getting back to nature and so forth, they have a sort of a notion in their head that everything out in nature is wonderful and sweet and gentle and kind and loving and accepting, and it isn't. It's wild. There's a big difference between our ideals of what we would like and then the reality of the world. Because as it is, everything's out there to eat something else. I mean, things that are alive don't exist without consuming some other form of life. And that includes us, of course, but everything out there is like that. And they're not tame. And, like the videos that you see of some idiot trying to ride a bison in Yellowstone, it's really a dumb idea. It's a wild animal, and you need to give it distance and respect and be cautious whenever you are approaching something that's wild. And that includes spirit beings, because they're also wild, some of them especially. And you may not know enough or understand what can happen when it comes to that. So in this case, my instinctive reaction of respect and backing off, and then thinking the process through and realizing that for some reason this being was like stuck in a house, and finding a way to show it the way out by using my piece of selenite and leading it out of the house and getting it back outside where it belonged, was the right thing to do. That doesn't mean I'm always going to be right, but so far I've survived. And then there's the land guardian spirits that are out there. I've encountered a number of them, because in our area, there's a lot of leftover, well, leftover is the wrong word. There are still a lot of guardian spirits that were recognized and nurtured and made offerings to by the native populations that used to inhabit all of North America. I only know about the ones that I've encountered, but I've encountered a number of them. And when you are awakened, or when you start to awaken to your abilities, you start to see spirits and nature beings and interact with them, then those kinds of spirits notice you. It's like you're not invisible to them anymore. And when they notice you, they have an expectation of how you should treat them. So with land guardian spirits, they expect you to give them an offering and say, hey, we recognize you for who you are and the job that you do, and we're really thankful, and we're really sorry that people have forgotten about this. And then they're usually fine. It's just this kind of, hey, I'm here, hello, are you going to like say anything back? And they want that kind of recognition. So I've done that. And there was the one in my neighborhood, actually, that's like across the road. And you know, we had our encounter. I did my offerings. Everything turned out well. And I figure that was the end of it. And then we had this person who came into our house, this man who turned out to be pretty much crazy, delusional, and all sorts of strange things going on in his head. And he comes into my house, and then all of a sudden this land guardian comes into my house. Now, this is not something that happens on a normal day. You don't usually get them coming into your house because, they're there to, like, protect the land, not your house. I was kind of startled, and I didn't quite understand yet why it did that. And I'm like, okay, I felt it, the guy who was here. And I'm like, well, that's interesting. So that's not something to worry about in the sense, because that's the land guardian, and we're on good terms. But I'm curious as to why he's here. And then later turned out, like I said, the guy turned out to be somewhat crazy, and then he started like acting out, making threats. That was after he left the house. And then I realized that the land guardian had come in to warn me that something was up. It's not happened again. So I consider that a good sign that I haven't had anyone else wandering into my house going like, hey, something's up, watch out. So there are, I'm sure, lots of other types that are like that are out there. And every culture is going to have a different set of them. And in the stories and the myths that are about them, I tried finding out that the big two-headed guy, I actually met a native here in my area who knew the name of the being. And somewhere in one of my notebooks, I have the name written down, but I can't find it. Maybe one of these days I will find out where I wrote that down, and then I can let you all know. But she knew exactly what it was, and she knew what I had done, and that is what happens, because that's the story. It's like, that's one of those beings that if you meet them, it can make you go crazy. So that was sort of an interesting verification from the culture that this is from. But when I was trying to do research to try and find out, figure out what it was called and stuff, or find out stories about it, there's all these stories about these different beings, like lake beings and wood beings and forest beings, and on and on and on. And almost every one of them is like, warning, don't get near these things. They'll eat your children and take them and drown them, and so forth. And I think that is probably to protect the average person who would not know what to do or how to do it, and would likely not survive an encounter maybe. But that's the same kind of thing. It's like when you're on a different level of experience and you encounter something like that, there's different rules, I guess, that apply to those encounters. And I don't know exactly how to say what they are. I just know that they are. So I just thought it was time to share another one of my experiences and see what you all think. It's just such a strange thing to encounter at some point in your life. And anyway, hope you guys are doing well. And this is Siofra Bradigan, and this is Siofra's Magic Alcove. Blessed be.